Welcome to week 20 of our journey through the Bible. This is day 96, and we begin studying Jewish poetry. That may not excite you, but when you understand how it works and how much it has to speak to your life, I think you'll find it very encouraging. A good way to get into this maybe is to look at the first chapter of Job and just read that chapter. You may not understand or have questions about the story you read there, but you will find that it reads very much like you would expect to read other places in the Bible, and much like you would read an article, a newspaper column, a blog. It's narrative writing. It tells a story. And we've, particularly in these history sections, been focusing on the parts of the Bible where it's telling a story. But then when you go to chapter 3 in Job, you notice that the whole style changes. Very often in a printed Bible, or even in one you're looking at on a screen, you'll notice it's put on the page differently, that there's more line breaks, that the lines aren't justified, that depending on how the particular printer did it, it indicates that this is poetry, that it's a different kind of writing. There's a different style here. And just as in English, we read poetry a little differently than we read regular narrative. Also, you'll notice many times in the Bible when you read prophecy, that is, someone is speaking a word of prophecy under the power of the Spirit, it is also written in this similar way. Now, Hebrew poetry, while different from English poetry generally, is a very beautiful way of expressing truth that has a way of connecting to our hearts. Hebrew poetry does not have any rhyming words, but it connects thoughts, and it does it in some very specific ways. Let's look at the first one. Psalm chapter 3, verse 1, you'll notice that there are basically two lines or two concepts. And the second one repeats the idea of the first one. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Same idea, just expressed slightly different. Then there are other times where the second line or the second thought contrasts with the idea of the first line. So for instance, in Psalm 1, verse 6, we read, For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Those are contrasting ideas, sort of opposites. And then a third pattern is when the second line develops the idea of the first line. Back to Psalm 1, the very first sentence. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. Now you see how that first thought, not standing in the counsel of the wicked, keeps getting expanded with each of the succeeding statements. Another pattern takes place when the second line illustrates the idea that's given in the first line. So, for instance, a very familiar sentence from the Psalms that does that is Psalm 42:1. As a deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. One thought is an illustration, a picture of the other one. You will enjoy the poetry of the Bible, and it'll be much more meaningful if you are aware of a little bit as you're reading it, what it's doing, how it's approaching things. I think you'll find this very helpful if you'll take a few moments and consider Psalm 1 and look for these patterns in just the first psalm. It will begin to give you an idea of how to look at this poetry and to read it with maybe more clarity and more appreciation of what's happening. Now, all of this is part of what we call a section in our Bible called the wisdom literature. Generally, there were three divisions in the Hebrew Bible, or in what we as Christians would call the Old Testament. There was a section called the Law, then there's a section called the Prophets, and then the Writings. Now, we call the Writings the books of poetry. And this week, that's what we're going to be focusing on, is these books of poetry. There are 5 of them: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Each book of these books has a different purpose, and we'll look at each one in turn. The first book we'll be looking at is the book of Job, and it will seek to answer the often asked questions, why do the righteous suffer? We're going to begin looking at the story of this man who lived before Abraham, this man named Job. You may want to begin reading ahead in Job and studying it. It reads like the script for a play. It's a very powerful book, but it's one that's worth a lot of digging into. Let me get you started by reading just a portion of the first chapter of Job. This is in the narrative section. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Now, in verse 13 it says, there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and there came a messenger to Job and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. A number of catastrophes happened, but finally in verse 19 we get to the greatest one. And behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And I have alone escaped to tell you. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.